Fred and I started the job at Miller Security Solutions on the same Monday and instantly bonded over our mutual hatred for our manager, Rob, in the very first week. The place was a grinder, and Rob was a nightmare. He'd make us spend our nights pulling Cat6 cabling through crawl spaces and mounting cameras for barely enough cash to keep the lights on. But both of us were pretty desperate, so we endured. The first month was hell. Rob was the usual blowhard who loved the sound of his own voice. He'd hover over our shoulders, nitpicking every misaligned camera angle or bad cable management. We were just the new guys, trying to keep our heads down and stay invisible, hoping he'd eventually find someone else to torment. But he didn't. If anything, he started acting like a straight-up jerk. He'd call us demeaning names, belittle us in front of customers, and find any excuse to dock our pay. About a month in, we realized he was skimming off the top of every job, quoting customers a premium price and pocketing the difference, but we couldn't do a damn thing about it. He owned 40% of the company, and he had the books cooked so tight they were bulletproof. Beyond the money, the guy was outright cruel. He knew most of his employees couldn't afford to walk out the door and extracted 2 people's labor from 1. So, when he mentioned he was taking off for a long weekend to visit his sister in Florida, Fred caught me by the loading dock and pitched the idea. He said we knew the alarm system like the back of our hands. He'd done this kind of thing back when he was living on the streets. He'd promised we'd be in and out, grab enough valuables to even the score, and clear out without a trace. It made me nervous, honestly, but I hated Rob's guts, and the idea of watching him spiral when he realized he'd been hit was too tempting. So, I said yes. We spent the whole afternoon planning the robbery. Breaking into his house took us about 90 seconds. The house was huge, pitch black and freezing. We swept the main floor with our flashlights, scanning for anything worth grabbing. Fred snagged a watch from the master bedroom, while I cleaned out Rob's wallet collection. After we'd picked the main floor clean, I told Fred it was time to bail. But he said guys like Rob were always loaded and kept their real valuables tucked away somewhere hidden. He wanted to explore a bit longer, so we headed to the basement. It was even darker down there. We swept our flashlights around, but all we saw was a laundry room. Fred was pretty bummed. I told him to let it go. We'd already taken enough. We were just turning to leave when my elbow hit a drying hanger. My flashlight fell, and the beam landed on a doorway back in the corner. My heart did a flip, and Fred froze. That door wasn't on any of the blueprints we'd seen. It was a heavy-duty steel setup with hardware that probably cost more than we made in months. Fred grinned. He said we'd hit a jackpot. It took him about 4 minutes to pick the lock. The door groaned as it swung open, but the second the smell hit, I nearly threw up. Fred was gagging right behind me as well. I pulled my sleeve over my nose, took a breath, and stepped inside. When the light hit the walls, we both went dead still. Soundproofing foam covered every inch of the place, old and stained with dried blood. It was caked on everything, from the floor to the ceiling, like it had been sprayed. Chains were bolted into the concrete. The links were worn smooth, as if someone had been pulling at them for a long time. Suddenly, a little whimper came from the corner. Fred swung the light over, and I screamed. A young girl, about 11 or maybe 12, was chained in the middle of the room on a mattress that was soaked with blood. Her lips were bleeding, and there were finger marks on her neck and face. Her wrists were bruised, and she was sobbing, trying to yank at the chains. Fred made a choke sound and leaned against the wall to steady himself. It took me a good 5 minutes to breathe normally again. I was trembling like a leaf. It took me 3 attempts to dial 911. I gave the address and stayed on the line, while Fred sat down on the floor next to her, talking to her quietly. I don't know what he said. I was stuck staring at the walls while I waited. Every inch of it was covered with photos, chopped off hair, severed fingers, and jewelry of his victims in jars. I couldn't believe I had been breathing around a freaking monster all this time. The cops arrived in 11 minutes. They got the girl out first. She didn't say a thing until they were outside. Before climbing into the ambulance, she mumbled appreciation towards us. We were detained the same night. They caught Rob 2 days later at his sister's place 4 states away. Fred and I got charged with breaking and entering, but the charges were reduced. We cooperated as much as we could. Just about every employee showed up to testify about what kind of guy he really was. The women talked about the threats and creepy comments. Fred and I got canned, obviously, but both of us are still in the same line of work. I don't really know what else I'd do, but every time I open a door I'm not sure about, that smell hits me before I even see anything. I don't think I could digest how close I'd been to evil all along and how oblivious I had been. I'd been in that house a dozen times. I'd done maintenance, tweaked his cameras, even stood in his kitchen shooting the breeze while he poured me coffee. The whole time, I was walking on top of that basement floor and had no idea what was being buried right beneath my feet. I'd been a professional locksmith for over a decade, so I was used to any reason a person might have for needing their locks changed. Mrs. Devlin's case seemed like another standard job when she called me on a Wednesday morning in August, saying a friend had given her my number. She asked if I could get out there right away. She gave me an address on the edge of town, where the houses are massive, with fountains and never-ending driveways. I told her I was already booked for the day, but she insisted she needed to replace her locks urgently. She even offered to pay double. When I pulled up, she was already watching from the front window and had the door open before I'd even finished walking up the path. She was jumpy while she explained what she needed. She wanted the most unpickable deadbolt I had, and the whole time I was working, she kept peeking out the window at the street. When I finally asked if she had a specific reason to be worried, she opened up a little. She'd gone through a messy divorce recently. Her ex had been harassing her, and while her lawyer was handling it, things were moving way too slowly. I didn't pry for more details. I did my job and told her to check. I'd swapped out the front deadbolt, put on 2 heavy-duty interior chains, and updated all the hardware on the back door. It took me about 3 hours, and she paid me well. When I handed her the new keys, she let out a massive sigh of relief. I told her she was in a much better spot than she'd been by that morning, and I meant it. The locks I put in were top tier, and the install was solid. By the time I got home, Mrs. Devlin had already slipped off my mind. Late that night, I was doing laundry. When I picked up my jacket to throw it in the wash, a key clattered onto the floor. I realized I'd accidentally walked off with a spare. I thought about just mailing it back, but considering her situation, that didn't feel right. I decided I'd drive out there in the morning, return it in person, and apologize for the mix-up. I was back at her place by 8 the next morning. The front door was already cracked open about 4 inches. I stood on the porch and called out her name. Nobody answered. So, I pushed the door open a few inches with the flat of my hand and peered into the hallway. The entryway table was flipped, and the mirror had been knocked off the wall and shattered in the corner. I called out Mrs. Devlin's name and stepped inside. I found her upstairs, sprawled on the landing in a pool of blood. It was horrifying. Someone had smashed a wine bottle over her head and used the jagged neck to finish it. My stomach turned and I backed away, fumbling with my phone to dial 911. I sat on the porch steps, shivering in the morning air until the sirens came. When the cruisers pulled up, the flashing lights seemed too bright for such a quiet street. The detectives took over in seconds. They took me to a van and started drilling me with questions. Where was I last night? Why was I back so early? They listened, but I could tell they were just waiting for a slip-up. They told me the deadbolts I'd installed were completely untouched. There was no sign of forced entry, and to top it off, they found my prints everywhere. I was arrested, charged, and got 11 days in county jail. It's a miserable place. My lawyer kept telling me to hang tight, that he was digging up something to clear me. But it's hard to believe in process when you're staring at concrete walls all day. Finally, they got the breakthrough in pharmacy security footage from across the street. It showed a figure wearing my exact work uniform approaching the house at around 3 a.m. My van was clearly in the frame, parked in her driveway, but I was sure my van was locked in my garage across town, and I was dead asleep at the time. Whoever it was had cloned my keys and even had a replica of my work van. It took them 3 days to track her down. It was Lauren. She'd worked for me 2 years back. We'd had a brief, messy thing, and when I ended it, she didn't take it well. She had a fixation. I'd fired her and hadn't given her a second thought since, but she'd been stalking me all along. When I started seeing this other girl from Hinge, she couldn't take it and came up with this plan to punish me. She'd lifted impressions of my van key, tracked my routes, and memorized my quirks, like how I'd sometimes pocket a spare key out of habit. She'd built the whole scene to frame me, counting on me to come back and discover the body. Lauren received 18 years. Mrs. Devlin's daughter, who flew in from abroad for the trial, apologized while sobbing. I attended the funeral and couldn't come up with the words to offer condolences. I am still a locksmith. Friends tell me to get out of the trade, but quitting feels like letting Lauren win and take something else from me. But the episode has left its mark. I don't move fast anymore. Before I leave any job, I lay out every single key on the passenger seat of my van and count them against the work orders. I haven't cut an extra key since. I still dream about that front door standing ajar, 4 inches. How mundane it looked from the sidewalk. How easy it was to just push it open and walk into my own nightmare. And I haven't slept properly since. As a child, I aspired to be an interior designer. I wanted to help people make their homes look appealing. At 17, I even landed an internship at a custom woodwork shop where we built high-end hotel doors and heavy-duty hardware. About 2 months later, my parents died in a crash, and my entire dream shattered. I needed steady money and ended up drifting into locksmithing through a friend of a friend. It wasn't the plan, but it kept me fed. 9 years later, it remained my profession, but now I was obligated to be on call around the clock. The night hours usually paid better. It was a lazy Saturday night in June. I was half asleep on the couch watching Deadpool. The table clock read 2 a.m. Suddenly, my phone buzzed. It was Mr. Turner. He was a retired professor in his 60s who lived across the street. He'd lost his wife a few years back, and his kids never visited him. People around said his son got busted for dealing, and he'd cut him off from the will, but that wasn't my business. Honestly, he seemed like a regular guy who kept his lawn neat, left his porch light on, and waved when I pulled in after work. But he was usually private, so a call late at night felt off. I picked up and barely even managed to hello before he cut in. He sounded shaken. He said that he was trapped inside his house. The front door mechanism had completely seized up, and he couldn't get the latch to budge. He was scrambling to make an airport run and was starting to panic, so he asked if I could come over and take a look. I told him I'd be right there, grabbed my tools, scanned the street, and headed out. Outside, his place was pitch black. It was the first thing that set me off. Turner always kept the kitchen light on out of habit from when his wife was alive. I crossed the street and called his name from the porch, but the place stayed dead silent. He didn't turn on the lights or respond. I pressed my ear against the door, listening for anything, but only got dead silence. Dread started crawling up my spine. I was genuinely worried for the person. So I hurriedly picked the lock. Luckily, it was a standard deadbolt and took me maybe a minute. The second I stepped inside, the temperature hit me in the face. It was weirdly cold, as if the heat hadn't been on for hours. The whole house felt empty. Walking in, I started shouting his name, telling him the lock was fine and he could go pick up whoever he wanted. But he wouldn't reply. I did a quick scan. His reading glasses were sitting on the side table. There was a half-finished glass of water on the kitchen counter, and the TV remote was resting on the armchair. Everything looked like it should, but the house felt oddly hollow. I kept calling his name as I headed for the stairs. The bedroom door was open. Turner was in his chair by the window, back to me. I'd seen him sitting there 1,000 times from my own place. His reading lamp was buzzing away. I called his name again. He answered in a rather timid voice that seemed to be coming from afar. He said he was fine, just embarrassed about the whole thing. Relief washed over me. I told him it was fine. I had taken care of the lock and he could go pick up his guest. He thanked me again and said there was still some time left and that I could leave. He'd lend me the money. I nodded and turned around, but I couldn't shake off the crawling unease. Something just didn't fit right. I sidestepped to catch the angle of the wardrobe mirror and froze. Turner's head was rolled to the side. His mouth was hanging wide open, and his eyes were rolled all the way back in his head. If he had been dead all along, who was talking? My mouth dried up, and my palms turned sweaty. I kept talking, explaining the problem with the lock as I carefully looked around. I spotted a figure behind the bed. He was scrunched down flat against the floor and angled away from the mirror's sightline. He was contorting his whole body, but his jaw was working slowly, throwing his voice right at Turner's chair. I heard myself tell him I'd be off then and see him in the morning. I hurriedly walked down those stairs 2 at a time, stepped out the front door, and pulled it shut. The second the latch clicked, I shoved my tension wrench into the keyway and threw the deadbolt. He hit the door before I was halfway across the street. By the time I made it back to my porch, he was screaming at me, calling me names and promising to make me pay back. I called 911, standing on my porch, watching his shadow pacing behind the frosted glass of the front door. The cops showed up in about 6 minutes. They caught the person, trying to force the back window right before he could scramble out into the alley. The person was a friend of Turner's estranged son. The kid owed him money, probably for drugs, and sent this person to collect. When Turner ordered him to leave, he choked him out. But before he could escape, the deadbolt jammed behind him. He'd actually swiped Turner's phone, which had me saved simply as Locksmith, and called me, hoping I could get him out of there before I realized the old man was dead. The rest of the night was a blur of flashing lights and answering the same questions over and over. I didn't get home until almost dawn, and I sat in my kitchen, unmurdered coffee, waiting for the sun to hit the counters. For days, I couldn't shake off the voice in my head. I couldn't digest being steps away from a murderer who would have killed me in a blink. I'm still a locksmith. I work the same hours and live in the same neighborhood, but I don't pick up unknown numbers after midnight anymore. And now, every time I walk into a room that feels even a little bit off, I inspect the mirrors before I do anything else.
I used to drive a semi-truck years ago, and it was a job that I had for a while. I still drive trucks, but not semis, and it's a completely different schedule for me now. But anyways, probably my scariest memory from driving a semi took place in my last year on the job. It was nighttime, and I was driving on the highway. I don't even remember what state I was in, but it was pretty late at night, and I would be pulling off to get some sleep soon. There were a number of truck stops on this highway, but by now it was getting close to midnight. I knew where I was planning to stop for the night, and it was maybe 30 minutes to an hour up the road. By this point, there were not many other vehicles out at all. As I drove in the right lane, I was going around the speed limit of 70 miles per hour. I remember that a car appeared behind me, went into the left lane, and then passed me. It then went in front of me to the right lane. But after going in front of me, the car then started to slow down a little bit. If I was going 70, this car was probably now going like 68. I realized that I was slowly gaining on him, and I was going the complete same speed on cruise control. This annoyed me slightly as I got closer and closer to the car, because I had not changed my speed, but he slowed down. I was wondering if the car would realize that I was gaining on him and speed up, but it did not. So then I switched lanes to go around him. I sped up, past the car, and then went back into the right lane when I was by. However, moments later, the car sped up and went into the left lane to get around me. This person must have realized that they had slowed down too much. So very quickly this time, the car passed me going much faster. It went a good ways ahead and then changed lanes when it was pretty far in front of me. I figured this guy was going to go faster this time and not let the same thing occur. At first he was going at a good speed and way up the road, but then I started to slowly gain on him once more. This was really annoying. I was pretty sure that it was all on accident, because why would somebody intentionally do something like this? It was a pretty absent-minded thing to do. When I got like right up to the guy's bumper, after having not changed my speed at all, I had to go around him again. So I did. This must have really made the guy mad. I don't know if he thought that I was trying to race him or if he was trying to play games with me, because he started speeding up when I was in the left lane to pass him. I just said, okay then, and I moved back over to the right when he was in front. Then he did something crazy. He went into the left lane and started slowing down. I was still maintaining the same speed and in the right lane. Then I started to pass him because he slowed down so much, and I didn't know what he was doing. But then he sped up and then cut right in front of me. He left hardly any space. I couldn't just slam on my brakes and stop, so I nearly hit him. He went a little faster, but was driving really close to me. When he did this, I honked at him, as this was seeming to become a road rage incident. I didn't bother to switch lanes. I knew that the truck stop I was planning to go to was coming up just ahead, so I kept driving with the guy right in front of me. He went a little farther ahead, but not by much. Then when we got to the exit, I pulled off at the very last second to the truck stop. I saw the car slam on his brakes, but it was too late and he missed the exit. I didn't know what he was trying to do now, but I was glad to get away from him. So I pulled in and parked my truck for the night. Then I went in the building for a short time before returning to my truck to go to sleep. I got inside, covered my windows, and went to the back area where my bed was. However, not too long after getting back there, I heard the sound of someone banging on my door. It was very loud and persistent. I did not know who that could be. I got up and went over to the door. Before opening it, I looked out. There I saw some random guy. I didn't know who he was, but then I realized that he must be the driver of that car. He started yelling at me to come out and fight him like a man and stuff like that. I told him to go away. I had no interest in fighting that clown. After his yelling and banging on the door persisted, a few other truckers nearby started yelling at the guy because he was being really annoying. He eventually stopped and yelled at me some more, as well as the others who were annoyed with him. Then he stormed off and left. I could not believe it. The whole thing was his fault because he wasn't paying attention. Driving a truck is a lot harder than driving a little measly car like his, but he didn't seem to realize that.